In part 2 of this one-part series, we looked at our inability to acquire any demonstrable, repeatable, actionable knowledge of God, His will, and His character. If you'll give it 2 seconds of thought, you'll realize that people living today know, and I mean know, nothing more about God and His supposed will than people claimed to know 3,000 years ago. Indeed, it's likely that believers from the ancient past would see today's believers as heretics and infidels, having jettisoned practices and beliefs these ancient peoples considered sacred and essential. I've stumped numerous believers by asking them which society they find most moral: the modern liberal pluralist democracies of the West, or the post-conquest kingdom of the Hebrews circa 1250 BCE, when people claim to have a direct link to the divine. As yet, no believer has picked the genocidal mob, though I won't be surprised when it finally happens. Today's believers have even less of a claim to knowledge, as they no longer even claim to have prophets who supposedly talk to God. Instead, they are now entirely dependent on the ancient writings of those who were said to be privy to the divine will at some point in the past. My former religion, Mormonism, claims to have living, sometimes breathing prophets and apostles. But these guys somehow couldn't tell the difference between vicious racism and divine instruction, which is why they doctrinally embraced keeping blacks from holding their priesthood for 150 years. Something they now admit was nothing more than sheer bigotry. It appears they were more in touch with Satan than their risen Lord. Having nothing more than the cryptic, often contradictory writings of ancient peoples who claimed knowledge of the divine via the revelation of the one true God, believers in God's holy word have over the millennia splintered into different sects, disagreeing on doctrines both large and small. There are actually more Christian sects than there are world religions. Apparently, agreeing on the divinity of a particular book makes any kind of solidarity regarding its contents even less likely. So aside from our inability to acquire any demonstrable, repeatable, actionable knowledge of God, His will, and His character, we also have a book said to contain the supposed will of God, the contents of which inspires more conflict and more division than perhaps any other book in history, even among those believing the book to be the holy, revealed, or at least inspired word of the Creator. In fact, this book said to contain God's holy word and will is so lacking in clarity that any time I've quoted from it here in my videos to make a point, believers have told me that the Bible needs to be interpreted, and interpreted correctly, suggesting I'm not quite hitting the mark even when I'm quoting verbatim. Of course, when I ask how exactly one would go about interpreting the Bible correctly, and how one knows when that's been accomplished, there is no answer beyond the believer's subjective opinion. And yet, these are the people who will tell us that the divine morality supposedly given to us by God and passed down to us in this book is objective, even while admitting that their book containing their objective morality requires the interpretation of human beings, who are without a reliable process for doing so in a way which promises and objectively delivers any kind of fidelity. When one believer claims to have found that correct path, you can rest assured that some other believer will disagree, and with scriptural backing to boot. Without some input from above, we have absolutely no way to know which road to follow, and such input performed a spectacular disappearing act some 2,000 years ago. Even if God exists, even if the Bible genuinely contains God's holy word, we clearly have been left to figure things out for ourselves, either via the subjective process of biblical interpretation or by coming together and reasoning about how we might best pursue the well-being we all desire. What is clear, though, about these two alternatives is that those who believe they're speaking for an omnipotent and vengeful God promising His own unending final solution for those who disagree, sincerely or not, will never surrender to reason, consensus, or evidence which runs contrary to their preconceived notions of what they, believe their God wants. The same conflict and division which plagues the church and demonstrates the believer's inability to find any kind of objective guidance, even within their own holy book, will continue to encroach on the rest of us, who have decided that reason, consensus, and evidence are the last best hope for a peaceful world devoted to the well-being of all peoples. Even when they agree that the world we've created is morally superior to the post-conquest world of 1250 BCE. You know, when people objectively knew even more about God and the divine will.